Hello and welcome to another episode of Paid Forward. I'm your host Raman and I'm joined today by Toby Hart, who is the co-founder and managing director of Nusa Studios, a social-first content studio based here in London, and they specialize in stopping thumbs for some of the world's hottest brands. As a nimble team of in-house production specialists, they combine scalable creative ideas with an agile approach to create some outstanding content for social media campaigns. So thanks for tuning in. Let's get to it. Hi Toby, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's an extremely hot day for the end of September, but here we are.
Yeah, it is. To be honest, I'm melting as well a little bit here. So yeah, and I had my winter wardrobe out. But back to summer.
Nice.
Yeah, nice to have you on the pod. Thanks for taking the time. I'm actually trying to remember how we met. I think it was actually Rob from High Rise that connected us. 2023, I think. It's roughly when I think it was. So Rob, if you're listening, shout out to you. Thanks for connecting us. But yeah, great to have you on the pod. And obviously wanted to pick your brains on all things creative today. So thanks for making the time for us. I guess in terms of just sort of setting the scene a little bit here, could you tell us a little bit more about you, Nusa? Yeah, just let's get into the details around kind of your specialism.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on. Really great to be on the podcast. And I can give you a bit of a background of how we started, how Nusa started, and sort of my journey, if that'd be helpful.
Yeah, amazing.
So I started out doing kind of freelance photography, freelance video, doing a lot of terrible kind of music videos, wedding films, that sort of thing. So I met my co-founder Pete just through mutual friends, and we were both kind of the camera guys from our groups at school. Yeah, he had a drone company at the time. I'd actually just dropped out of studying psychology at university to do film. And yeah, I got brought along on this sort of like road trip around Europe, filming all these amazing places on a drone, which was really cool. We had a few funny stories. So this was back when drones were absolutely gigantic. Obviously nowadays they're about the size of a matchbox, but our drone had 8 propellers and it was in a huge Pelly box, which was enormous basically. And we'd stay in these kind of really small, pokey Airbnbs whilst we were on our trip across like Spain and France. And one of the places we stayed at, we actually couldn't even fit the drone Pelly case through the door. So we had to like take it off the hinges. We were all sleeping in this kind of like tiny room with like a massive box next to us. So it was a fun little trip. And I think myself and my co-founder Pete, we both just like really bonded and really just like enjoyed working together, filmed loads of cool stuff. And from there we ended up just like kind of falling in love with surfing, weirdly. As we were sort of down in the coast in Spain, in Santander. So we very naively decided to start our own production company and said, we're going to make these surf films, we're going to email 200 different places across the world.
With drinks.
There might have been a few drinks involved, yeah, there was probably a few drinks. We decided to just email all these different companies, and I think one of them got back to us, so we ended up filming some stuff out in like Indonesia, which was really cool, and then did a few different jobs in like Morocco and Sri Lanka. Had a lot of fun, filmed some cool surf stuff, and then quickly realised we weren't making any money. Moved to London and really like focused on what problems we could solve for brands. I think this was around 2020, so obviously it was kind of the year that COVID sort of happened, and a lot of brands had gone online, a lot of brands had gone digital. It was this sort of era of like Facebook ads just being really, really effective. It was almost like the Wild West of just people pumping loads of money into Facebook ads. There was this explosion of e-com. And we'd luckily kind of stepped into that scene with our background in video production. Obviously, if you rewind even sort of like 5-10 years, you needed huge crews of people to shoot content. The cameras weren't really set up to do like more run and gun style filming, and it was just like a lot less accessible. Whereas we were on this kind of cusp of what I like to call is the sort of DSLR filmmaker generation. So you have cameras like the Canon 5D, the Panasonic GH5, and they could just shoot amazing stuff just in a really small form factor. So kind of that combined with riding that wave of digital first brands really sort of popping up. We started Nusa Studios. Nusa, what it is today is a social first content studio. We're primarily sort of video production, and we're social first. So we create content that is made specifically for social and to be really effective and perform well on social. So that's kind of how we started, and then we've just sort of grown organically really, obviously since 2020. It's been 5 years now, so Yeah, the team's grown a bit. We've moved studio a couple of times and just been having a lot of fun making cool content for different brands. We've worked with kind of larger brands like Ford and Amex, but also some really fun kind of scale up brands like Surreal and Lucky Saint. Yeah.
Wow, amazing. What a journey. Brilliant. Thanks for giving us a lowdown on kind of how it all started. Yeah. Amazing story. Just in terms of then jumping into some questions and actually quizzing you on all things creative, as I was saying earlier, got a few things I want to kind of get into with you. I guess the first thing I want to talk about is within the social media space, and obviously you say that, you're kind of a social first creative agency. What do you feel is kind of truly thumb stopping these days, and how might that have changed? But more kind of recently, what's stopping thumbs?
Yeah, great question. I think for us, that is always the number one question for any brand or any piece of content. How can we stop thumbs? And that is essentially, how do you command attention in a very saturated market? You've got, you're not only competing against other brands in the space, but you're also competing against other influencers, other creators, people's families that they've got on social, and even people are looking at social whilst watching TV at the same time. They call it second screening. So you're really competing against sort of a lot of different factors. For me, social thumb stopping is quite interchangeable with social first. So we kind of think of that in three key pillars. The first one is that kind of attention grabbing angle. So how are you getting attention? Are you being surprising? Are you being emotional? Are you being personal to that kind of audience? That is the number one important thing. And then we also look at two other things. So the volume of content, so creating enough content. Obviously social is quite a hungry beast, especially when you're looking at performance content. You need lots of content with different kind of variations, different hooks, that sort of stuff. And then the third thing is kind of what I like to call content hygiene, or sort of best practices. So there's obviously a ton of different rules and best practices that Meta set out, and those change quite a lot. Almost it feels like week to week. So really making sure you're doing the basics and you're creating content that's fit for the platform and also the placements. So that's kind of what I'd define as sort of thumb stopping or social first, is those kind of three key pillars.
Yeah, it makes sense. So I think it's quite interesting that you said sort of quantity of content as well. That's kind of within the mix, whereas that's quite interesting obviously hearing from a creative agency, because you'd expect creative agencies to go no quality over quantity, but I think you rightly pointed out, and we see that ourselves as well running a paid media agency, that you do have to feed the beast and you do have to do testing at scale. You can't just kind of go for, super polished or perfection, because really you can't, the data will tell you what perfection is and what perfection isn't. It's not kind of superficial or just the look and feel of the content. It's actually what's resonating and what's stopping thumbs. And the real way of kind of finding that out, I guess, is actually doing some at scale testing. So that's very interesting. Just kind of moving on to, you getting a creative brief from a client. Oftentimes that will come with brand guidelines, right? And then obviously you've got the kind of what works on social and the social first aspect of creating content. How do you square the two? Because there will be clients perhaps that are like, no, this is our brand guideline. We want you to follow this sort of religiously. So do you feel kind of brand guidelines sort of help, or do they hinder in sort of a social first creative strategy?
Yeah, I'd say I've got more of a traditional sort of marketing view on this. I think a lot of people creating content for social fall in the trap that they have to follow best practices, and that means that the content purely has to be entertainment focused and the brand has no kind of role in that, which I think is flawed to some extent. It's kind of what TikTok used to preach, which is make TikToks, not ads. And I think there's quite a lot of research out there now which in a lot of ways contradicts that. I think it's a real creative challenge to be able to bring those kind of distinctive brand assets into an ad, but in a kind of authentic way. And I think often the trap that people fall into is because it's hard, they just don't bother. And our teams even struggle with it. It's really hard to bring in those kind of brand codes, whether it's kind of a logo, colors, that sort of thing, especially when you're working with kind of more lo-fi creator content. So yeah, I think there's obviously brands that are doing it really well, like Duolingo with their owl is probably the most common example. Like Guinness has their kind of iconic sort of pint shape with the black and the white. So I think it's really about bringing those brand codes through, but in like a really authentic way in the social content. Interestingly, there's a lot of research about how different distinctive brand assets are. Some are way better than others. So things like jingles or anything like sonic identity does really well, and especially on TikTok, it's a very sort of sound on platform. Yeah. If your brand has like a jingle or some sort of sonic asset, use it and really double down on that. Another one is characters, which a lot of brands don't seem to double down on. I think that's probably, I don't know, I guess it's kind of a cultural thing. It feels like a lot of ads have celebrities in, but maybe not kind of brand characters, and we've probably moved a little bit away from that sort of animated world. But again, those have been proven to be really, really effective. So I think those are some areas that really interest me in terms of how we can bring the brand through in the creative. I actually read, interestingly, there's been a paper released by System 1. They're sort of like a creative effectiveness platform, and TikTok. And they looked at a massive data set of ads, and they actually found that, like creator ads specifically, if the creator was upfront about the kind of video being an ad, it was actually way better for like viewer retention and like the brand effect that it had, which surprised me. I think a lot of people try to make ads that feel like organic content, but I think the best way to approach it is actually create content where you're respecting the viewer. You're showing that you're actually selling something to them, or you are a brand, but you're still having that kind of like fun, entertaining element to it. I think that's really interesting.
That's particularly interesting for me because one of the buzzwords in creative world and marketing world is an interrupt. And it's funny because obviously a lot of brands are trying to, reminder ads, for example, or post-it note ads. And a lot of brands are trying their best, I guess, to make an ad not look like an ad. The funny thing is now that's become a pattern. And so you've got to go back to making an ad look like an ad. So I think I find these things quite cyclical. And ultimately everyone starts doing the same thing, and you've got to go and do something different, because that's the only way you're going to interrupt any pattern or stop thumbs. Very interesting in terms of kind of what you've seen and what that study's shown.
Yeah, I think it's just to touch on that point. I guess the whole trend of creating ads to not look like ads maybe stems from the fact that people like currently just kind of hate advertising, which I find fascinating. I think there's a lot of chat in the industry about how, if you look back like 20 years, people would actually look forward to like the TV ads, that sort of thing. And I think we do obviously live in a very different world now. People see like thousands of ads a day. Back then, content was probably owned by those kind of big TV channels, so probably the content wasn't as good as what you see today on kind of like Netflix, so people are willing to skip the ads to get to the good stuff, the content. But I do think there is something to say about creating more entertaining, more creative advertising for consumers and respecting the audience as well. I think that's probably typically more kind of high level at brand level, especially for bigger brands. But I think it's something that we're talking about a lot, and something that I think can really make a difference. Yeah,
no, that makes sense. It's brilliant. Okay, so sort of following the same trajectory, so kind of a brief comes in, and you get sort of brand guidelines, and obviously then you're looking at, okay, how do we integrate brand guidelines into the creative work that we're going to be doing? What do you think kind of makes an idea? And obviously now you're starting to come up with ideas. What makes an idea sort of platform native instead of repurposed?
So I think for me, a repurposed piece of content is almost like an amphibious vehicle. It can go across land, it can go across water, it might fly. But it's probably pretty shit at doing all those things. So you really want to get to a point where you can create content specifically for those platforms. Now, the real issue is people don't have unlimited money, so it gets very tricky to do that. So I think often for brands, it is a bit more of a grey area, kind of an in-between. What is really good at the moment is that TikTok and like Meta are quite similar in terms of the kind of content they're pushing. So sort of like Reels and video content on TikTok, and obviously YouTube is quite separate to that. So, I think it's a tricky one, but I think being platform native is important.
And do you feel that when you are producing content, that it's fairly easy and it's sort of to a brief, brand new conceptualization, storyboarding, all the rest of it? Do you feel that there's a way of cutting it and making it sort of almost native to each of the key platforms, YouTube, TikTok, Meta. Is that kind of typically what you end up doing anyway? And filming it, even to having that at the back of your mind while you're filming it, to make sure that you're actually sort of recording content that's going to be suitable for each of those platforms.
Yeah, I think it's something that needs to be thought of early in the process, and it's a more strategic decision and something that should be in the brief or discussed at briefing stage. I think for me, I see it as almost a spectrum or a sliding scale. So at one end, you're shooting one piece of content, and then in post-production, you're basically just changing the aspect ratio, changing the size of the content, the length of the content, that sort of stuff. And that's kind of the easy bog standard approach. And then if you go right up the other end of the scale, you're basically shooting entirely different concepts, and you've got different shoot days for different platforms. And where most people sit is probably in the middle, and where we often shoot is kind of shooting with we use visual guides on our camera displays, so you can shoot frame for vertical, but then also frame for landscape, things like that. So I'd say that middle ground is where most brands probably want to sit, but if you can try and stretch your budget to have a more kind of specific channel approach, I think that works really well. And I think the problem a lot of brands have is actually having a consistent brand across all of those channels and even placements. So it really helps to have that consistent, whatever it is, a creative platform or that one idea that you're expressing across all of those.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you've got a unique perspective of working with the big boys, right? So you've worked with MX, you've worked with Ford. How do they do it? Are they briefing you to kind of be middle ground, or are they going more to we want to make sure everything is sort of exclusively filmed and all of the conceptualization, everything is sort of platform specific?
Yeah, I'd say the bigger brands obviously have more budget, and they're a bit more flexible in terms of that. But we also see so much innovation from the smaller brands, right? There's so much that you can do when you don't have those multiple layers of sign-offs. We work with a brand called Surreal, which people might have seen on LinkedIn. They seem to be big on LinkedIn, but they're not afraid to take risks, and they make content that is a little bit more different and a bit more risky, and that really pays off for them. So it's either kind of budget or bravery. It's kind of choose one, really.
Yeah. Fascinating. Just I guess then moving on to the kind of the next step here. Around, you've been briefed. So let's say, you've been briefed by a brand and they say, let's throw the kitchen sink at this. We want sort of platform native content for each of the main platforms, YouTube, Meta, TikTok. What does that look like then in terms of, I think you've spoken to that a little bit already, but a little bit more detail and flesh around kind of an example perhaps of what that might look like.
Yeah, so like I said, I think Meta and TikTok are quite similar sort of channels. So I'd probably be focusing on kind of more lo-fi creator style content for that. And then Meta, you can also be creating some more hi-fi content. And then YouTube is kind of completely separate. And I'd say probably a lot of that stuff is more hi-fi, shot in landscape. Brilliant.
Yeah, thank you for taking me through that. I guess moving on to the next question. So what's the most important part of making a social first video? What makes it different to anything else that you might film?
Yeah, I'd say the most important part of any social first piece of content or ad is that first few seconds. It's really interesting. I think a few years ago, a lot of people were saying the first 5 seconds is really important, and now it's changed to 3 seconds. And then I've heard people now saying it's 1 or 2 seconds. So I think it really is that initial first few seconds of the video, and that is purely because you're competing against so many other pieces of content, ads, etc. For me, I look at it through the lens of how can we get people's attention? Yeah, so a few years ago I read a book by Patrick Fagan, who's a behavioral psychologist, and he kind of laid out this framework for how to get attention, which I often go back to. And there's kind of four letters, so it spells out SEP, which I always think of the kind of disgraced FIFA president, Sepp Blatter, and that's how I remember it, very random. SEP stands for surprising, emotional, primal, and personal. So I can go into each of those. So surprising is anything sort of out of the ordinary that you wouldn't expect to see. So any kind of fast movement, anything which just jumps out of the screen at you, right? Emotional is anything that's going to make you feel something. Obviously, there's a massive spectrum of different emotions. Research shows that the positive ones are a little bit better. So ones that are a little bit more surprising or happy and associated associated with positivity are really good. Primal is essentially anything that we are kind of naturally disposed to like paying attention to. So that might be like fire or food or sex or faces, things like that. Those are going to get people's attention, obviously. And then the last one is personal, which obviously Meta does, or any platform is doing a lot of the hard work in finding those audiences, showing it to the right people. But now, obviously, with targeting and data privacy laws changing, it's getting a lot harder to target people and audiences specifically. So creative is sort of the new targeting. So really thinking about what does your audience look like? How can I, show talent or creators that kind of reflect the audience back to themselves? There's this really interesting effect called the cocktail party effect, which if you haven't heard it before, it's essentially the idea that you're at a really busy cocktail party, there's loads of people in the room, busy chatting away, you can't really hear much, but somehow you hear your name said from across the room. And that's because your subconscious is always kind of listening out for things that are really personal or have personal context to you. So the brain kind of almost has this bouncer built into it, which is filtering out all this unrelevant information. And as soon as you put something super relevant in front of someone, they pay attention to it. So I think that's really, really fascinating. So yeah, that's kind of the framework I use. There's tons of different frameworks you can use, but that's how we're often grabbing attention.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, amazing. Moving on then to kind of, I guess, what's hot right now, and to be fair, has been for a while, is UGC content. And obviously brands find it relatively easy and cheaper, of course, to get content creators to do the content for them. I mean, what your view may be a little bit biased here, but UGC content versus polished content, where do you stand on that?
Yeah, I think there's a time and a place for both, really. Obviously, I think it's been great for brands that UGC content is really effective, and I think that's, it's allowed brands to grow where traditionally they'd have to spend, like millions of pounds on a TV ad, and now it's a lot more affordable. So I think that's been really great for brands. I think for me, there's no hard and fast rule. I think it comes down to a number of factors. It might be the marketing objective, the channel, the placement, the kind of brand perception. A good kind of rule of thumb that I like to use is, if you want to shoot content that is lo-fi, it's probably, we want this ad to feel like a recommendation to a friend. We want it to feel more authentic and building trust. If it's hi-fi, it's probably more, we want the brand to make a statement. We want to reinforce our brand. It's probably a little bit easier to bring out those kind of brand codes and distinctive brand assets. So that's often the way I look at it. I think an interesting thing that a lot of people often forget as well is that a lot of the value inherently tied up in advertising is about kind of virtue signaling. So if you see a billboard ad or if you see a TV ad, people will subconsciously know that you've spent a lot of money to be in that place, and they will associate that brand with, well, if they've got that much money, they must be doing pretty well as a brand. They must be established. I'm going to trust them. Whereas if you're seeing a brand on social media and it's just a video shot on a phone, obviously the barrier to entry is much lower. So you're not building as much trust. So it's just something that I like to consider when making ads as well, is like where the media is being placed as well is hugely important.
I see. I'm gonna follow this up with another tough question, probably how long is a piece of string question, but is there a good ratio there in terms of sort of polished production versus lo-fi?
I wouldn't say we follow any rules for ratio. One kind of like easy, I guess, blanket assumption to make is that at the higher end of the funnel, you're creating more hi-fi content, and at the lower end, you're creating lo-fi content. I don't think that has to be the case for every brand, but I think if you have limited budget, that is one way of kind of like segmenting your content and approaching it, because the hi-fi content allows you to bring out the brand a little bit more, whereas the lo-fi content allows you to create more volume because it's cheaper to make. And you can make more, like have more diversity, have content more personalized to different audience segments, that sort of thing. So no hard and fast rule on ratio there from me, but yeah, just a little tip on how we sometimes like to approach it.
Yeah, that sounds good. Amazing. Moving on. The next question I wanted to ask you was sort of, where does psychology, behavioral science sort of play into the work that you do?
Yeah, it plays into the work we do massively. I think for me, advertising or marketing is really all about combining science and art, and obviously the science part is that kind of psychology element. Humans are obviously naturally very difficult to understand. Our brains are very complex. We barely know anything about the human brain. So I think psychology allows us to make those kind of broad stroke assumptions about how people might behave, and we can follow certain heuristics. We can say that, like I said earlier, a surprising ad is more likely to get someone's attention. So I think it's really helpful to think of it in that way. There's some really interesting conversation going on in the industry right now about attention spans, and obviously a lot of people will say social media has shortened our attention spans, whereas from the research I've read, our attention spans are exactly the same. Obviously humans aren't evolving really anymore, and we've largely had kind of the same brain for the last few million years. So actually it's much better to frame it in the way of how are people being primed for those different platforms. So when you go to the cinema, you're primed to watch a film, and you're primed not to look at your phone or be distracted, and you're really immersed in that experience. For YouTube, it's probably a bit more in between, where you're actually more like a TV experience, where you're a little bit more invested, you're paying a bit more attention. And then obviously social platforms are kind of right down at the bottom of that list, where it's your attention is very kind of sparse and not very kind of focused. And yeah, there's a lot of research as well that suggests that attention is linked quite closely to advertising effectiveness and sort of larger brand effects. So I think it's really important that when we are creating content for social and kind of social platforms, we're really trying to maximize that chance of holding our users' attention. I think a viewer's pretty much primed to be distracted and not pay attention. So how can we use creative to really flip that and make the most of their attention?
Yeah, very interesting in terms of the attention span concept. And I guess what I wanted to kind of underline there is it is platform specific. I think you make a good point about people being in cinema, and you know that they're going to be there for a couple of hours, and there's that expectation that they will be there. But if they're scrolling on TikTok, then yeah, that's not going to be the case. So and I guess your content has to adapt to that. The way you're conceptualizing things and your hooks, what kind of hits them in the first 3 seconds on TikTok can absolutely be different to what it looks like perhaps on YouTube. In fact, actually, the ad can be skipped after 5 seconds. You got them for at least 5 seconds, right? It's not 3 seconds. So yeah, very interesting, fascinating stuff. Okay, amazing. Moving on then to, I guess, my next question, which is, obviously a lot of brands, DIY, they're creative. What kind of things do you look out for? What do you notice when you look at DIY creative content from brands?
Yeah, I think it's really important that brands create their own content. I think the barrier is much lower now to be creating your own content. And there's obviously much better editing tools out there, much better equipment, and there's just a wealth of information out there, not to mention AI, which can kind of give you any answer you need when it comes to how to use a camera or anything like that. So I think brands should definitely take advantage of that. And I think content is really important in today's marketing landscape. I guess in terms of common pitfalls, I think it's probably lack of strategic planning beforehand. I think a lot of brands kind of go in and probably say, oh, we want to shoot all this content. And I get it. I think, even ourselves, we say it's really important to get a high volume of content. But I think brands can kind of over-index on that, go to a shoot and just try and get a load of different clips, which can be really good. But I think I would encourage brands to be a bit more strategic and say, what's the outcome we want to get to before we actually kind of rush in and start shooting. So kind of a nice way to think about it, well, first of all, is a lot of brands aren't even thinking about what objective they want to achieve from a marketing standpoint. Do we want to drive awareness, consideration, or conversion? Like, how do we want the audience to feel? If it's top of the funnel, we want them to feel something. If it's middle of funnel, we want them to think something. Or if it's the bottom of funnel, we want them to act and do something. So really thinking about what is the impact that we want to create here. What do we want people to do when they watch this content? So I think that would probably be my thoughts. I think having a bit of a stronger link between marketing and creative, and being able to communicate what your marketing objectives are to a creative team or to your creatives, I think is really important.
Yeah, okay, makes sense. Okay, moving on to brands. Let's say brands decided that they've invested in UGC, they've been trying it for a long time, and now time has come to go sort of proper polished production, get a studio house involved and get proper content. Not to say UGC is a proper content, but ultimately the conversation tends to be around budgets, right? So how do you think CMOs, head of marketing directors, how should they split their budgets between creative and media buying? So is there a ratio that you sort of typically see, or is there a way of thinking and a mindset when thinking about creatives and splitting that budget-wise, splitting that up into either creative bucket or a sort of paid media buckets, let's say?
So yeah, traditionally I think brands have kind of used the like 80-20 or 90-10 rule, where it's 80% on media budget and 20% on creative. And I think that probably came from kind of traditional sort of like TV and advertising, that sort of stuff. I don't think there should be any hard and fast rule. I think it really depends on the brand. Obviously, some brands are much more creatively led and they're going to spend more money. Some brands aren't and they want to spend more on media. What I would say is that media has become cheaper over the years. The cost of advertising across Meta, across social platforms, has become much more democratized for a lot of brands. It's a lot easier to advertise. And creative hasn't got much cheaper. If anything, it's got sort of more expensive. Attention's more scarce than ever, and people at the moment kind of hate advertising. People pay money to skip ads, right, and to have an ad-free experience. So I think it's really important that we're like doubling down on creative, and we're really pushing that. Especially, there's a whole conversation at the moment about privacy rules and regulations. It's getting harder to track audiences. So the creative is almost the targeting itself. So I think there's a bigger and bigger case for investing in good creative. So obviously that is an extremely biased view because I run a creative production company, but I would suggest for people looking at budgets to kind of factor that in. Creative is becoming more and more important and a bigger lever for like advertising effectiveness.
Yeah, makes sense. Amazing. Okay, moving on to I think the subject that's on everyone's mind, AI. How do you see kind of AI fitting into the creative process? I guess if you could speak to particularly about Nusa and how you might be using AI or not using AI, and kind of what your predictions might be more generally about the industry and AI.
Yeah, so I think AI will massively change our industry, especially across creative and production. I think probably within like 3 or 4 years, it's really going to shake things up. But I think in the immediate term, we're going to see things moving quite slowly. And it's that classic kind of case of people underestimating the long term and overestimating the short term. I think it was like a Bill Gates quote or something like that. And yeah, I think at the moment, interestingly, I assumed that post-production and editing would have the biggest sort of impact because it's very kind of executional and quite technical. Whereas it's actually been the inverse of that. Post-production hasn't had a huge amount of innovation, and where we've seen AI actually most useful is in the creative process, that kind of like mushy, more loosely defined part of the process, and that is for things like copywriting, idea generation, and like sketching out storyboards and things like that. So we're really seeing a lot of gains from that. I think that will obviously change over time. If you look at that Will Smith eating spaghetti video, it's pretty scary. If you look at that 2 years ago versus today, it's like worlds different. So I think if you kind of assume that rate of innovation is gonna continue at the same rate, then I think like video content is gonna get really, like AI generated video content is gonna get really good. So we're sort of looking at future-proofing obviously the business by looking at things like working more with celebrities, creators, and actual kind of personalities. I think as AI content becomes more popular, there's obviously going to be a bigger sea of just generic content. Audiences are obviously going to look to find ways that they can trust different brands or trust different media companies or creators, and that is through personalities that they know and they know are real people. So I think it's really important that we lean on those kind of people, and we're featuring like celebrities more and talent and that kind of thing. So I think that's really interesting. I think, more original content would be really interesting, documentary style content, and just more storytelling. I'm really excited about the possibility that AI can really open up from a creative perspective. If you think not long ago, when you were to sit down and write a book, it would be this incredibly hard task. But I think already and like in the near future, it's going to be easy for a brand to write their own book or make their own kind of like entire feature-length film. I think all these things are gonna raise the standard for what good creative kind of looks like. So that really excites me.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. I think just going back to what we were speaking about earlier about sort of pattern interrupt, and the definition of pattern changes from time to time, right? The patterns change. And so as the generic content floods the market using AI, all of a sudden, that's not new anymore, and that's not thumb stopping anymore, and you gotta change strategy again. So it's definitely an enabler, AI, I feel, and from a productiveness point of view, whether it's creative process, marketing process, any process, you just got an extra sort of brain power at your fingertips to be able to thrash out ideas pretty quickly. But I think as generally speaking, something floods the market, people want to break away from that and do something different, and that's invariably what's going to end up happening. But it's unless of course AI, the content generated by AI is imperceptible to the human eye in terms of whether it's real or AI. But I know there's checks and balances being spoken about in terms of, sort of tagging AI as AI. Fascinating times ahead for sure. Amazing. So kind of moving on to my next question. So, when we talk about sort of content, a lot of the time, particularly in the paid media world, where I come from, the thought process behind all of the content generally around performance. Question is, can a content build for performance also build brand equity? Is there anything sort of available there or something tangible within that content that's also going to sort of deliver some brand equity? Or should you be, if brand equity is the goal, then you've got to do the content very differently, and it's not necessarily about performance. You're trying to deliver the messages differently and executionally and strategy wise. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting question. I think a lot of brands struggle with this because there's so many different factors that go into it. I think one thing to always consider when you're starting to look into it is how mature is your brand and what's the size of the brand. There's a really interesting tool, I don't know if you've heard of Tracksuit. They're like a brand tracking software or sort of platform. And they've actually got a calculator on their website where you can put in information about your company, and it will actually recommend you, this is the percentage of spend you should put into brand, this is the percentage you should put into performance. And I'm sure it's not kind of a hard and fast rule, but at least gives you a bit more of a grounding. I think for me, obviously, ads can do both. And they can build brand, they can drive performance, but it can get a little bit messy and tricky to do both. I think the research actually says that brand ads are better at doing both, whereas performance ads are generally just good at performance. And I think a lot of smaller and younger brands, they're obviously fishing in this kind of pond that hasn't almost been fished before, so you can rely more heavily on performance content. But as you get bigger, you're obviously kind of overfishing within that same pond, so you don't want to just throw in more fishing rods. You actually want to grow the size of the pond. So I think that's really important. And I always go back to the kind of 95-5 rule, which is 95% of the people are not ready to buy your product. So you're not trying to actively sell to them. Only 5% are kind of in market ready to buy. And I think that's a really nice reminder of why it's important to kind of have your brand across all your content. Because 95% of the time you're trying to get people to remember you. You're not actually trying to get them to click something. You're actually just trying to be remembered, so that when they do eventually get to the point where they're ready to purchase, they think of your brand essentially. I think you can do both in the same ad, but I think from a creative, from a briefing, from a strategic standpoint, it's a lot easier to kind of separate out those ads and say, look, the objective of this one ad is to be conversion focused, or is to be awareness focused, or consideration focused. I think that's really helpful. Otherwise, it gets a little bit more tricky.
Brilliant. Okay, moving on then to a cheeky question. Will you be generous enough, obviously not asking for any commercially sensitive information, but could you talk me through Nusa's sort of creative process from idea to delivery? Kind of what kind of things do you think about typically, and sort of how that process flows?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I can talk through our kind of rough process. So generally every project starts with a brief, and that's a really important part, and a part that I think a lot of brands kind of struggle with. So putting together a really cohesive brief with a clear objective, a marketing objective, kind of key messages, audience is really important, and then obviously all the logistical parts like timeline, budget, all that sort of stuff. Once we've got a brief, we can then put together a proposal where we might put together initial ideas or just like a general creative approach. Hopefully the project gets signed off, happy days. We then move into kind of the creative stage. So some brands might have a creative idea already, they're ready to go, they want to shoot something. Whereas some brands might know that they want to create a campaign or drive a certain marketing objective, but they don't know how to do that. So In that case, we'd really start by just engaging the brand and trying to immerse ourselves within the brand. So sometimes we'll do a bit of an immersion session where we just get to know the brand, ask questions about their audience, ask a ton of questions about the brand, that sort of stuff. We've started doing creative sprints as well. So it's a really nice kind of couple of days where you actually sit down in a room with the client and you essentially ideate together. So the first day is essentially coming up with as many ideas as possible. And we've got like different frameworks to how to kind of think of those different ideas. You're just getting a ton of different ideas on the wall. And then the second day is actually refining those ideas, grouping them together, killing a few of the ideas, which is sometimes painful, but part of the process. And then narrowing it down to those kind of like narrowing it down to that one key idea that you really like. And that forms the basis of your kind of creative platform, which you can then create all your content from. From there, we'll then put together like a creative deck. So that will go through basically like the look and feel for all the different deliverables we're making, storyboards, all that sort of stuff, so that the client can see, you know, what the content's gonna look like essentially. And there'll be a process of sign-offs with that. At the same time, the production, sort of pre-production process will happen. So we'll sort out things like models, talent, all the logistical kind of parts of the shoot. And then after that's all sorted, we'll move into production, which is shooting everything. So sometimes we'll shoot, well, most of the time we end up shooting on location. So it might be like a house location or something lifestyle looking, or we might shoot in our own studio if it's something a little bit more product focused. And then all the content gets passed to our post-production team, and they handle everything. So they do everything from kind of assembling the edits right through to like color grading, motion design stuff, bit of light VFX, sound design, all that sort of stuff. And then there'll be kind of a bit of back and forth in terms of different amendments, like giving little adjustments and making sure the content's perfect before it goes live. And then often we hand it to agencies like yourselves, and you guys run the ads, and then happy days. We're rocking and rolling.
Brilliant. Okay, yeah, thanks for outlining that. I'm going to ask you a left field question now. Who's got who's back? Is it the guy with the camera, or is the guy with on the desk sort of post-production editing guy? who's more important for the creative sort of best creative output?
Oh God, I'll get into trouble for answering this one. It's really interesting. I think I used to be, well, when we started Nusa, myself and my co-founder Pete, we would just do everything. So we'd like come up with the ideas, shoot stuff, edit stuff, produce stuff, etc. Whereas now I'm a little bit more removed from that process, so I can see it from further away. And I think it is really tricky because on one hand, you've got, on shoot days, there's a huge amount of pressure on the team and there's hardly any time. So it's very rare that you'll go on a shoot that's actually running on time. I think just the amount of problem solving you have to do and things that come up, it's quite a stressful environment. So I think there's a reason that phrase "fix it in post" has become popularized. And it's because, production might just run out of time to be able to do something kind of practically or like in real life essentially. So they might need to rely on the post-production team. Then it gets handed over to post-production. They're like, great, we've got like all this extra work because we've got to fix this stuff that you guys messed up. So I think there's always going to be, pointing fingers and stuff, and obviously it works in reverse as well. So you've got the kind of production team or the creative team, and they're saying, well, the edit doesn't feel right, and it's not following the brief. So I think it's really important just to have really effective communication between those people. I think for us it's great because we're an in-house team and we all kind of know each other quite well.
Yeah.
I think it gets more tricky on much larger scale productions just because you've got so many people working on stuff, you've got so many people feeding back. It makes it a lot harder. I honestly wouldn't say that any role is like more important than another one, just because filmmaking is like so collaborative and you need all of those different steps to make it work. So
no, fair enough. You haven't lost any friends today. That's good.
I've not thrown anyone under the bus. No.
No, that's great. So, it's always an interesting one. I remember one of the copywriters I used to work with and the designer. They would always kind of fight about does the copy come first, or does the creative come first? Yeah, it was quite an interesting. I was just listening from far away. That was an interesting conversation in terms of what comes first. But yeah, I think I guess the answer is a good team will, you kind of looking after each other, because there's always going to be something that's not going to be perfect. You have kind of a second opportunity in post production, for example, to get it right, and then the other guy's feedback as well, and the final output. So yeah, very interesting. Cool. Just a couple of more questions left for you. Could you describe kind of what a good client agency relationship looks like within the creative world?
So I think a good client agency relationship is just built on really strong trust. I think chemistry is actually way more important than people probably think. Obviously, there's a lot that goes into kind of the pitching process and an agency's capabilities and all that sort of stuff, but based on my kind of background in psychology and all that sort of stuff, I often think that it can come down to just how well you can get on with the client and how much you personally connect with them. And I think that is what forms the basis of that trust. When it comes to production and creative, there's just a hell of a lot of unknowns. Our industry isn't like even like a construction industry. You kind of know that there's a certain process to follow to build a house, right? And there's certain regulations and things you have to follow. With creative work, there is no fixed process or way of doing things. It's highly subjective, and there's just a lot of unknowns. So I think it's really important the client can trust you there. A client that's going to be really worried or second guessing your every move is just going to slow down the process and just make it horrible for everyone. So I think that is kind of at the heart of any good sort of client agency relationship. I think also I think a lot of creatives can lean on the idea that the client is wrong, right? And say, well, we know best because we're creatives. But at the end of the day, you don't know the brand as well as that person. You don't even know the audience as well as the client. And there's always a reason that someone thinks a certain way or looks at the content in that way. So I think it can be often easy to point fingers, but actually trying to take a step back and say, why does someone interpret that piece of work in that way, or why are they thinking about the creative in that way, I think is really important. And often it is just making sure that it's fit for the audience, and the audience is often not involved in any of that conversation. I think that's one thing we can all improve on.
Makes sense. Just slight sort of related, but a slight segue from that question. When a client's choosing a creative agency, what should they be looking out for? Let's say, it's a mid-tier brand wanting to dabble into kind of polished production, get a studio involved for the first time. So it's their first time. They don't really know sort of what to look out for. What would you, if you were in their shoes, what would you advise?
Yeah, I like that question. I think it often comes down to the work, right? You can, with creative work, it's quite nice, and with agencies, it's quite nice with what we do because you can just directly see our work, so how good it is. I think on top of that, again, it goes back to what I was talking about, that kind of relationship element as well. If you feel that you can trust them, and I think there has to be that kind of layer of trust. I think that's really important. Yeah, I think it's probably that combination of work capabilities, but then also that personal element of trust. I think one element that's often not thought about as much as well, and it's probably helped us win loads of work, is an agency that's really hungry for the work and really wants to do a good job. And I think that often comes through in how people talk about their work, or those kind of conversations you have with agencies. And maybe you lose a little bit of that when you get to the kind of the bigger agencies, or people that have been doing it for a long time. Yeah. So I like to think we've still got that kind of hungry spark in us.
Yeah.
Obviously, I can't assess that, but yeah.
Makes sense. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Kind of final couple of questions from me. So in terms of briefs, what excites you and what kind of brief falls flat?
So I think with briefs, there's two key sides to it. You want your brief to be really tight, and it's called brief for a reason, because it needs to be brief and not 2,000 pages long. And it needs to be really laser focused on what do you want to achieve with this brief. I think for me, I'd love to see more briefs with kind of specific KPIs. So we're always really pushing clients to say what do you want to achieve with this? Is it do you want to achieve a certain thumb stop ratio across different ads? Do you want to increase brand awareness by, X amount of percent. So I think for me, it's being much more tight with it and just having a really clear objective. But then on the other side of things, you also want it to be like open enough and open to interpretation. And I think a lot of that comes through how a client will present a brief to you, how they chat to you. You want them to be positive and open to ideas, and again, trusting that we're the creatives. Let us sort of come up with the ideas and let us wow you. So I think it's those kind of two opposing elements, that kind of, needing to be concise, brief, but also being open enough to allow for creativity.
Yeah, amazing. Well, what a fascinating chat. Thank you for your time, first of all. Some really interesting bits of information that's come through that's kind of invaluable in terms of how to think about creatives. Where can people find you? Probably
the best place to find us is either on our website, so www.nusastudios.com, or LinkedIn. I'm very active over there. So I'm Toby Hart, so TOBYHART over on LinkedIn. And we're across Instagram, TikTok, all those platforms as well. So come find us, come say hi. And thanks so much.
Brilliant. Toby, thanks for paying forward. Been great chatting to you. Insightful stuff. Thank you for your time.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.